Many people here for the panel this afternoon. I just want to say at the very outset that following the panel at about 6 o'clock, we're going to have a reception downstairs in the gallery where, if you haven't seen the images, you'll be able to see the works of art and to meet the artists and to meet the panelists. So that'll be a good opportunity. But we will go downstairs in the Bernstein Gallery for that. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge, I'll acknowledge the artist in a moment, but our curator, Kate Summers, who's sitting right here, who is the one who plans all of the shows that we do and has made it possible for us to put up shows that are not only distinguished works of art themselves, but also works that have a bearing to the kinds of social and policy questions that we're interested in the school. So we're always grateful to Kate. So I'm going to start, we're going to have the artist first, and I will introduce her. And then Professor Singer is going to speak, followed by two commentators, and then we'll try to work this so that we have a little bit of time left at the very end for discussion. But first, let me introduce Hedy Bice, who has created these works of art, and she will say something to you about them. She is someone, I think Kate has known for a long time here. I've known her because she is a local artist. She was trained at Bard and at Cornell. She also holds an MBA from Columbia University. She has given shows, recently solo exhibitions in Hopewell, in New York City, and in Melbourne, which is a relevant place for the program this afternoon. She's shown at the International Women's Artists Biennale in Incheon, South Korea, and many different places. She's also worked, as has Kate, at the Pilani Center in Cape Town, which many of our students know, and is represented out in the atrium of this building by the wonderful hanging that was created by the women of Pilani. So it's a pleasure to have Hedy here and to ask her to speak a few words about the show that's downstairs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. Just to give you a little bit about my background, I've painted all of my life, having grown up in a household with a mother artist, where art materials were readily available, and making art was an integral part of our daily life. I've worked both abstractly and figuratively, and explored using a wide range of materials in my art making. For the past several years, I've been working on a series of large-scale animal paintings in mixed media. I first started painting animals when, around 4 years ago, I discovered that the cherished glacial lake, where we have our summer cottage in the mountains of Pennsylvania, was threatened by fracking and natural gas exploration. This lake and cottage have been in our family for 5 generations and is a very special place in my heart. It's what I consider to be my wild place. While I have been actively involved in environmental issues in this area for many years, nothing on the scale of fracking has ever occurred in this area. Distraught about the possible impacts to this relatively pristine environment, I wanted to find a way to express my distress and angst, as well as my deep affinity and love for the natural environment. How to express this through art? After thinking about it for a while and trying different approaches, I finally decided to explore painting animals because animals are so integral to nature. They express nature, yet they're frequently overlooked and negatively impacted by human activity. And animals have no voice. I painted fish, birds, mammals, frogs, turtles, insects, and other wild animals like elephants and rhinoceros. Then a few years later, I read Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, in which he writes about speciesism, our systematic disregard for animals. I felt both horrified by what he wrote and inspired to respond. And this resulted in the 12 paintings on view here today in the Bernstein Gallery. While my earlier work focused on wild animals, the paintings in this exhibit is on animals that are factory farmed for food. The cow, chicken, pig, calf, goose, fish, and laboratory tested, the rat, monkey, cat, dog, rabbit, or negatively impacted by human activity, the California condor made extinct in the wild in 1987. So what is the process that I use as an artist? After reading about the animals in Peter Singer's book and looking at hundreds of images, watching videos, and doing some additional research, I create each animal by hand tearing and gluing down hundreds and hundreds of pieces of paper onto canvas. I use a wide range of paper and variety of paper, including handmade and hand-painted paper, which I paint myself, papers from around the world, such as Tibetan, Egyptian papyrus, South American banana paper, torn photographs taken on my travels in Asia and Africa. The only paint on the canvas may be in the splattered background. After building up the canvas with layers and layers of torn paper, I then rework the surface by cutting into it, scraping it, burning it, singeing it, and splattering it with paint. In some cases, I may look into how an animal is regarded in other cultures and incorporate pieces of this into the artwork, most notably in the cow on view here today. The cow is considered sacred in parts of the world, such as India, but a mere commodity in most of our culture, raised in factories for meat and milk. I stamped small words into the body of the cow: sirloin, flank, slaughterhouse. In some ancient cultures, cattle were raised for food and sacrificed, and could become so important to the culture that a number of gods took on the form of cattle. So I started printing papers with hieroglyphics from these cultures and incorporated torn bits into the artwork, as well as printed fragments of prehistoric cave paintings of the hunt. Occasionally, I will also use found materials, such as old broken linoleum floor bits pulled up during our home renovation, to provide a different texture and expressive element, as could be seen in the painting Calf. Calves are raised in darkness and deplorable conditions. The calf that I have in this exhibit is black in color and has no discernible eyes. I work intuitively and do not pre-plan my work or have a fixed idea of what the final piece will be. My approach in creating these paintings has been to try to express the essence of each animal as I perceive it. It is my hope that in doing so, the viewer will form his or her own response to the animals and the issues related to speciesism. For me, creating is a process of discovery, and I look forward to getting your feedback in the gallery during the reception after the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hitty, and I hope if you haven't already seen the works of art, you'll go down to see them. I think, by the way, that they make the point that Peter does. When I thought they were going to be paintings, and when I first looked at them from a distance, I thought they were paintings, and I walked up to them and I realized they weren't what they seemed to be, and I think that's Peter's point, which he'll make in his own way later. So Peter is going to lead off. Then we're going to have two philosophers who will comment on what he has to say, but in general on the problem. I'm going to introduce them in the reverse order that they're actually going to speak, and because I'm going to sit down, not come back again. The third speaker is going to be Professor Dale Jameson from New York University, where he is a professor of environmental studies, philosophy, and law. He's spending this year at the Institute of Advanced Studies on sabbatical down the road from us. And he is about to publish a book entitled Reason in a Dark Time, which is, I gather, a reflection on the uncertainties of climate change and what it has done to our thinking about how we deal with our world. The second speaker is going to be Professor Jeff McMahan, who is a professor of philosophy at Rutgers University and a neighbor of ours. I forgot to say, by the way, that Professor Jameson was trained as an undergraduate at San Francisco State University, and then he did his PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Jeff McMahan was trained at the University of the South in Sewanee, where appropriately he studied English literature, like everybody else I know who went to school there. It was a great school for that. He went on a Rhodes Scholarship then and did a BA in PP&E, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Corpus Christi College at Oxford, and then a PhD, interestingly, finally from Cambridge University, where he worked with Bernard Williams, a very famous philosopher, and he began the dissertation, I gather, at Oxford, supervised by Jonathan Glover and Derek Parfit. So he's had a very distinguished lineage of people he's studied with. He's taught at the University of Illinois, and then now for several years at Rutgers. He's published a lot, mainly on the subject of war. He began with a book called British Nuclear Weapons, For and Against, Reagan and the World, Imperial Policy in the New Cold War, Ethical Aspects of the Nuclear Debate, The Morality of Nationalism, and then the books for which he's best known recently, The Ethics of Killing, Problems at the Margins of Life, and Killing at War, published in 2009, all these by Oxford University Press. And then last year, The Values of Lives. He has two books on the way, one called The Right Way to Fight, and the other, The Ethics of Killing, Self-Defense, War, and Punishment. And last but not least is our own colleague, Peter Singer. And Peter is the Ira W. Decamp Professor of Bioethics here at Princeton University. He's a member of the University Center for Human Values. He is also a laureate professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne in Australia, of which he is a native. He is as well, or better known, I suppose, in Australia than he is here. He's gotten all sorts of honors there. Most recently, he became a companion of the Order of Australia. He has, of course, published very widely, but probably no book more famous than Animal Liberation, which Hetty has mentioned, which inspired the paintings downstairs, the works downstairs, and that was published in 1975. But they're among a large number of works. The one that has been of the most consequence for me, as I teach a course, a freshman seminar on philanthropy, and we always start them off by reading Peter's much more recent book on the ethics of philanthropy, which has had a profound effect on the way Americans think about the meaning of their personal philanthropy. So, without more, I'm going to give you Peter, and then he will be followed by Jeff, and then Dale.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. If the people standing want a seat, there are some seats up there. Feel free, you won't disturb me if you wander around the room there and take those seats. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's certainly an honor to learn from Hetty that my writings have inspired her to the series of paintings which is downstairs, which, if you haven't seen, I'm sure you will find very powerful and moving works. I thought that what I might do in talking about this is to do a little bit about placing these works in a tradition of artists looking at animals, an extremely ancient tradition, and intersperse that with some thoughts about the ethics of the way we do treat animals, which I think are particularly relevant to the exhibition downstairs. So if we think about art and animals, we probably begin right with the very beginnings of human art forms, of surviving art. And it seems that animals, along with humans, actually apparently hunting those animals, the first extant remaining works of art that we have. So this is something that is central, but we can recognise even in these extremely ancient works, we can recognise some understanding of the awareness of the idea that the artist is looking at an animal as another conscious being, as a being that is capable of suffering or perhaps of experiencing fear or something of that sort. And we find that animals are a constant theme in art. If we skip a lot of millennia and we come to Roman periods, we have a lot of use of animals in various ways. For example, this mosaic floor from the Roman period, which has many different species of animals. This is just a small section of it, beautifully portrayed in the floor there. And through medieval times, we have illuminated manuscripts that also show animals in various ways, in characteristic natural poses, sometimes also as, of course, as items of property. And that is indeed the tradition in which we have been taught to see them. If we look at the origins of the Western religious traditions anyway, we find this idea that God created us and the earth and created the animals, but then told us to replenish the earth and subdue it, and to have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And I believe that that set the tone for the next couple of millennia. Perhaps you could say, you can't really say what's cause and effect here. Perhaps you could see that this was the way we were treating animals anyway, and the words of Genesis merely reflect that and reinforce it, provide a justification for what we would have been doing anyway. And it is true that if you compare the Western tradition with religious traditions that seem to have a more egalitarian view of animals, particularly Eastern traditions, Buddhist traditions, for example, that tell us to have compassion for all sentient beings, or Hindu traditions which suggest we are reincarnated with animals. But nevertheless, that isn't reflected in the kind of sharp difference in the way we treat animals when you look at those traditions, perhaps with the exception of sacred animals like cows in the Hindu tradition, but even that is certainly not at all a one-sided picture of reverence and therefore good treatment of the animals involved. So I'm not claiming that this actually is, this verse has had a causal effect, but I do think it's reinforced the ideologies and enabled us to feel comfortable in ways that we might not have felt so comfortable otherwise. But we get that not only in the ancient Hebrew scriptures, of course, but we get it also in the philosophical tradition that's come through the West. We get it independently of the Hebrew scriptures in Aristotle, who says that essentially the less rational exists for the sake of the more rational, and therefore plants exist for the sake of animals, and the animals, the brute beasts, exist for the sake of man, to provide us with food or with skin or clothing or bones, useful implements. And that view of Aristotle's then was incorporated with the Christian, with the Hebrew and then Christian teachings through the work of Thomas Aquinas, who repeats these words almost exactly in his Summa. And then right up to the end of the 18th century, we get the view in Immanuel Kant that animals are just means to our end, claim that they're not self-conscious, and that they're there merely as a means to an end. Of course, there's two controversial claims there. One is that they're not self-conscious, and I think while some non-human animals are not self-conscious, I don't think one can say of all non-human animals that they're not self-conscious. Secondly, the argument that because they're not self-conscious, they're only a means to an end, seems to me quite fallacious. If you're conscious, if you can feel things, if you can feel pain, if you can suffer, or conversely, if you can enjoy your life, then it seems to me that you're an end in itself. That is, your pleasures or pains are good or bad in themselves. Hetty mentioned having painted a rhinoceros. I haven't seen that painting. This is pretty dark on my screen, isn't it? I guess it's recognisable. This is an 18th century painting by Jean-Baptiste Udry, a French artist, and this was, I think, not exactly the first rhinoceros to land in Europe, but the first rhinoceros to land in Europe and actually survive for some years. A rhinoceros known as Clara, who was imported from India, I think, by an enterprising sea captain who thought that he could make some money, and he did make some money from travelling around with the rhinoceros and exhibiting it. And this is a portrait of Clara, which I guess shows it as a kind of amazing beast that it obviously seemed to Europeans who had never seen a rhinoceros before, but does give it some sense of its own dignity, I think, too. It's not merely a freak to be exhibited. And Udry, I think, painted other animals in that way. This is a rather endearing painting of a bitch and her puppies. Udry also painted the menagerie of, I'm going to forget which Louis it is now, whether in that period, it might have a 18th century historian, Louis XV, was it? I'm not sure. Anyway, painted the menagerie at Versailles, and some of those are quite moving portraits. Some of them, though, you do feel, and they're also hunting portraits by Udry, you feel that this is a collection being shown off. These are things to enhance the status of the owner of that collection. And something of the same may be true of Stubbs' famous paintings of horses, which, again, I think, although obviously they show the beauty of the animals, they do show them somewhat as exhibits, as to own such an animal is obviously something that is only reserved for those who are very wealthy, as well as those who have a keen sense of what makes for a fine horse. And it's interesting to compare Stubbs' portraits of horses with this Qing dynasty portrait from the 18th century, which I think shows a lot more emotion in the horse, as indeed the title of that melancholy horse suggests. Perhaps the most famous or most often reproduced works of art relating to animals come from William Hogarth's 18th century engravings, The Four Stages of Cruelty. And this is very much art with a message to it. So there are four stages of cruelty that we see here, and in the first, it relates to a character who is known as Nero. In the first, you see the young Nero as a lad in London engaging in sports of cruelty towards animals, which, as Hogarth says in this, there were many disagreeable scenes of cruel treatment of animals in 18th century London, the very describing of which gives pain. There's clearly an empathy with the animals involved here. And so that's the first stage of cruelty, the making sport of animals in ways that make them suffer. Here we have the same Nero grown up, beating his horse to the point of collapse. Another of the forms of cruelty in London at the time, of course, was the overloading of horses that were pulling carriages or carts, and frequent beating of them in order to get them to perform better. And here the point is the horse has collapsed. That leads then to cruelty to humans. We see here, again, the character Nero having committed, it's described as seduction. It looks more like rape, you'd have to say, from the portrait there, as well as robbery. And the end result is that Nero is hanged and his body is dissected for the purposes of medical research, which Hogarth obviously thinks is a just fate. And the dog gets to eat the entrails. But this was very widely distributed, and I think was part of the move which you start to see in the 18th century, this more civilizing era in general. Things like prison reform become on the agenda, an end to cruel punishments, as reflected in the United States Constitution, and also the beginnings of ideas of that these flagrant forms of cruelty to animals are things that we should not have anymore. So that was probably one of the most effective works of art, as far as we can ever tell, without really being able to measure in terms of its impact on cruelty. But around this time also, we start to get a completely different philosophy being approach to philosophy. And you get it most clearly in the works of Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of the English school of utilitarianism. And utilitarians, of course, the classical utilitarians, were concerned to promote happiness and to reduce pain and suffering. And right from the start, right with Bentham, you get the inclusion of non-human animals as sentient beings among those beings that matter. So it makes a sharp contrast to Kant, although we're talking about the same period, but whereas Kant, coming from this tradition where it's reason, self-awareness, autonomy that make humans a moral being, and therefore having moral standing, mattering morally, depends also on those characteristics. With Bentham and with his successors in the utilitarian school, like John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick, you get it very clear that animal suffering matters. The questions about whether animals suffer in the same way as humans, how much they suffer, but pain is pain. It doesn't really matter if it's the same amount of pain, how much consideration we should give it, whether it's a human or an animal. A really revolutionary idea in an era when there was actually no legislation to protect animals from cruelty. This is 1780, this work, at least that's when it was written, it was not published till a little later. The first laws to protect animals from cruelty in Britain were introduced into British Parliament in the first decade of the 19th century, and initially they were only to prevent cruelty to an animal that was owned by someone else. The first law did not do anything to prevent an owner inflicting whatever cruelty he might like on his animals, and it was only subsequently that laws were introduced to protect animals as such, even from their owners. So Bentham is asking this about animals, perhaps referring to Kant's ideas that the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And he goes on in this passage, in fact, to point out that the French, sorry, it's a slightly later passage, obviously. The French, he talks about in a later edition, puts in that the French have recognized that the color of the skin is not a reason for abandoning a sensitive being to the caprice of a tormentor, referring, of course, to the fact that the French revolutionaries abolished slavery. And he says one day we'll recognize that the same is true for, and he then describes some other anatomical distinctions that might separate us from animals. So he makes the explicit parallel between the liberation of slaves in the French Revolution and what one day he hopes we will achieve for non-human animals. And we start to see, I think, also other works of art that are looking more directly at the way we treat animals. This painting of a butcher shop showing a conscious animal having its throat cut while it's being held down. And here an experiment, here a picture of vivisection of a dog, and this would also be in a period when anaesthetics were not being used and the dog is being held down while being cut open. Was a subject of, began to be a subject of controversy in England in the second half of the 19th century, eventually resulting in the first laws to regulate vivisection in the 1870s. So, this is the position that I want to defend, the position that Hetty referred to briefly in her remarks, that we should recognise speciesism as a prejudice that is not identical with, but has some parallels with racism or with sexism. That is, that we have an attitude of prejudice against beings who are not members of our species, that simply that biological fact is considered a reason for giving them a lower moral status than beings that are members of our species, irrespective of what in fact they are like, irrespective of what actually their characteristics or their capacities to suffer might be. So the ethic then becomes, I think, one of equal consideration of similar interests, which is not to say that humans and non-human animals always have the same interests. Of course they don't. It's also not to say that necessarily the reasons why it is wrong to kill a normal human being are the same apply directly to non-human animals. I don't think they do. But it's not species that makes a difference. So if you have a human being who, perhaps because of profound intellectual disability, is at the same mental level as a non-human animal, then at least considered intrinsically, putting aside the interests of others who may care for, love, cherish those beings, at least intrinsically, I don't think that there's a difference in the wrongness of killing merely due to the fact that one is a member of Homo sapien and the other is a member of one of the species of non-human animals. So, this is what the attitude that we have. Hetty mentioned factory farming as having been one of the things that particularly horrified her, so it's worth seeing it. Before you order your Thanksgiving turkey as we get into fall, you might think that this is how the overwhelming majority of them are reared. I guess probably 99% of them are reared in factory farms, crowded into huge sheds that maybe have 10,000 birds in a shed, and no individual attention at all. Some of them will collapse and die on the floor of this shed, but nobody will find them while they're ill and look after them. It's simply every now and again somebody will wander through the shed and look for corpses and clear them out before they get too maggot-ridden. But it's simply not worth the labour costs of looking after animals individually when you're factory farming them on this kind of scale. Chickens are kept not very differently. The meat-eating chickens are in sheds, similar huge sheds. And pigs, there's a pig downstairs. Well, this is how breeding sows are often kept in individual barred stalls, too narrow for them to turn around, and they're basically unable to do anything except stand up and lie down for the entire time of their pregnancies, which is most of their life, because once their piglets have been separated from them, they're made pregnant again as soon as possible. Even when she's suckling her pigs, she's not free to move around. She's kept in a kind of barred contraption because it's simply more efficient, reduces labour costs, you don't need good stockmanship, and you remove any danger of the sow rolling over and crushing one of her piglets, which if you gave her plenty of space and bedding and so on, she would very rarely do anyway. And then Hetty mentioned veal calves. This has been the standard method of keeping veal calves for many decades now. It is starting, fortunately, to be phased out. We've had recognition even from the veal industry that this is an animal that is, this is a method of producing veal that is harmful to animal welfare. So we are moving towards allowing veal calves room to walk around, but this has still been a standard way of keeping calves permanently kept in stalls where they can't walk, they can't develop muscle, which is considered a detriment to the quality of the meat. And they're also deliberately made anemic to keep the flesh pale, because you get a better price for so-called white veal than you do for red veal. This is a cattle feedlot, and again you have these vast areas with thousands of cattle kept in feedlots on a vast scale, and that also makes a contrast with the portraits that we have downstairs. So how do artists respond to this? Just let me very briefly say something about three contemporary artists who respond to this situation of the way in which we're treating animals. Sue Coe is a British artist who's done some very graphic both drawings and paintings. This is one of a slaughterhouse of animals filing into, pigs in this case, I think, filing into a gloomy and foreboding slaughterhouse. This is one of a series of paintings. It's called The Drowning Sheep, which she did about the live export trade that takes place from Australia to the Middle East. Australia gets rid of its unwanted older sheep, the sheep from the wool trade. The sort of lamb is generally quite young sheep, but when you produce wool, and Australia is the world's biggest wool producer, you have older sheep, and then the question is, well, what do you do with them? Well, it turns out that if you send them live to the Middle East, they have some commercial value. There is a market for them. They don't mind their mutton rather older than people who eat lamb. So these ships have been fitted out to carry something like 40,000 sheep live to the Middle East. And it has happened that things have gone wrong with the ships, that in one case the ship sank and the ships were drowned. In other cases, the ships were not able to unload because the Middle Eastern countries that they were exporting to said that Australia had been sending them sheep with diseases, so they prohibited them under quarantine grounds, and the ship is then stuck with 40,000 sheep. It's only got feed on board for the planned 3 weeks, whatever the voyage was. It's now sitting around out in the ocean, unable to unload, and in some cases they simply threw the sheep overboard. So I think that's what this painting is about. And finally, she has a series called Second Millennium, which is more like kind of Bosch-like nightmare portraits of what's happening to animals being ground up into meat, and that's a close-up of them going into the meat grinder. So that's one way in which an artist might respond, very sort of graphic, really horrifying images to try to get us to see how horrifying the way that we're treating animals is. Barbara Dover is an Australian artist who actually worked for many years in the animal movement, trying to bring about political change for animals, but has also used her art in a much more symbolic way. I think these are plastic containers that are stuffed with chicken feathers, and I think it's representing in some way the confinement of animals in factory farms, the crowding, and the way in which they become things that we can use in whatever way we like. But she's also used images, photographic images of animals, and there's a whole series of portraits of cows, which again is concerned to show us animals as individuals. And I think that if you look at Hetty's cow downstairs, you'll see something similar in the expression of these animals. This is one of the images downstairs that you find online. So the other way in which you do it is to present these animals as individuals and to show them with the inherent sense of being an individual, of being a life that is there, that can go well or badly, but has a point of view. There is there is a subjective experience going on. There is a subject looking at us, and I think that's what you get very clearly from Hetty's works downstairs. You get it from this portrait. You get it from some of the others that were of animals that are used in both factory farms and in research. I found the portrait of a rat particularly powerful because the rat is one of the chief subjects of laboratory research and has been horribly abused in experiments over many decades. And people have very little sympathy for rats. When you just mention the name, it's a term of abuse. But I think you can see in that portrait downstairs that a rat is an individual that has a sense of its own being, perhaps in some way, and is both inquisitive about its surroundings and has interests that we ought to be respecting. So the last word on art, though, I thought it was appropriate to give not to the human artist presenting animals, but to one of the animals themselves. So I'll close with a painting by a chimpanzee. Not sure what exactly it's saying, but we'll leave that for our interpretation. Thank you. It's nice.
I should begin by saying that when Stan contacted me to ask if I'd be willing to come talk to this gathering, my assignment was to respond to whatever Peter said. And I didn't know what Peter was going to say. So I haven't done any significant preparation for this. I was listening to what Peter said, and happily it did connect with something that I think is worth saying here. You will notice that throughout Peter's talk, the emphasis was on human practices that cause animals to suffer, and on cruelty, the notion of cruelty. So we saw Hogarth's 4 stages of cruelty. Interesting to mention that the 2 philosophers to whom Peter referred earlier on, Aquinas and Kant, explicitly say the only thing that really is wrong with harming or causing suffering to animals is that it leads people to become cruel to other human beings. And that's very explicit in both Aquinas and Kant, and one wonders to what extent that was the principal moral of Hogarth's series as well. I hope that you could see that in the first stage of cruelty, Hogarth is actually condemning the cruelty to animals in itself, and not just because it leads to cruelty to human beings. But you remember the quotation from Bentham that the question is not whether they can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And Peter then went on to discuss cruelty. Notice that the painless killing of an animal is not considered an instance of cruelty. And there really wasn't much discussion in Peter's remarks about the killing of animals. And that's what I really want to talk about in my 5 or 10 minutes today. It's very common now to think that if our practices involving animals don't cause them to suffer and don't involve cruelty, but do involve prematurely ending their lives or killing them painlessly, that's not such a big deal. We can, that's acceptable. So I remember reading many years back a little biographical portrait of Temple Grandin, an autistic woman who felt greater sympathy for animals, she thought, than she did for other people. She felt she had more in common with them, had more of an empathetic response to the way that animals feel than she could with human beings. And then she went on to design chutes for leading animals to be painlessly killed, in which they would be taken to be killed in a way that enabled them to feel calm and comforted and so on. And she seemed to think that this was a real triumph. And no doubt it is better, if you're going to kill an animal, to kill it in a way that doesn't involve causing it terrible panic and fear and so on. But I thought that was a very bizarre thing for someone who claimed to feel this empathy with animals to take to be a project, facilitating the killing of these beings towards whom she was empathetic. Peter also focused on factory farms in the examples he gave of our abuses of animals. The focus here was on the way in which the means of rearing these animals caused them misery and suffering throughout their lives, but not on the fact that these lives end in premature death. And I think a lot of people believe that while factory farming is really quite terrible because of all the suffering and misery that it causes to the animals, it's okay to buy and eat meat that comes from animals that are reared humanely. So a lot of people think that they're doing enough if they buy only meat that comes from places where the animals are reared without being caused to suffer and are killed painlessly. But I find that very puzzling. I mean, you might think, well, there is some general asymmetry between causing suffering, which is intrinsically bad, and causing death, which is not intrinsically bad. Death involves just the deprivation of the pure benefits of continued life. And so if you think it's less important to bestow benefits on individuals than it is not to cause them to suffer, that would support this idea that it's acceptable to raise animals without causing them to suffer, but then to kill them prematurely, though painlessly, in order to be able to eat them. But notice that we don't think that way about other human beings. We think that our being able to continue to exist is very important, just as important as it is to avoid suffering. In fact, we ourselves are willing to undergo quite a bit of suffering in order to be able to enjoy the pure benefits of continued life. So if you get cancer, most people think that if there's a prospect of a cure and a long life afterwards, it's worth undergoing chemotherapy and painful surgeries and all kinds of things that involve great suffering in order to be able to get the benefits of continued life. So why should we think that it's any different with animals? Why should we think that their lives are not important to them, or important for them, I should say, in the way that our future lives are important for us? Well, I think we should think about the killing of animals and the causing of suffering to animals in the way that we think about the killing of people and the causing of suffering to people. They're both bad, and they're both wrong, without some adequate justification. So suppose you get an animal that's been raised humanely to the point at which it's now time to kill it painlessly. When that animal is killed painlessly, it's being deprived of all the good life it would otherwise have had. And usually these animals that are humanely reared are killed very early on in their natural lifespan. So what makes us think that that can be justifiable, to deprive this individual of all the goods of its future life? Well, what we tend to do is we think, well, let's compare our gain to the animal's losses, or at least that's the way a certain kind of philosopher would go about thinking about it. A utilitarian philosopher, for example. I think if you do I don't think the utilitarian reasons are the only reasons we have for not killing animals, but I think they are the main ones. And I think if you think about it for a minute, you'll see that the animal's gains, the animal's losses in being killed typically greatly outweigh our gains. The gains that we get from eating animals aren't the pleasures of the entire eating experience. It's only the difference in pleasure between what we would get from a non-meat meal and what we would get from eating meat. So it's not all the pleasure you get from the meat that has to be justified. It's just the incremental gain in having meat rather than some good non-meat meal. So that's on the plus side, however many meals one gets from eating an animal. On the negative side, there's years and years and years of good experience that this animal could have, of which it's being deprived. And those of you who have lived with animals or know something about animals are probably aware that they enjoy their food too. I think my dog actually enjoys the kind of nasty stuff that he eats far more than I enjoy the good vegetarian stuff that I eat. And these animals would be eating all the time for days and days and weeks and months and years. So I think if you do the utilitarian sums, you get the conclusion that it's wrong to kill an animal painlessly, even after it's been reared humanely and kindly. So that's the thought I want to leave you with. If you have been moved by Peter's remarks and the paintings that you see downstairs, and you think that maybe you're doing well enough if you're getting all of your meat from Whole Foods and it's got little things that say, not factory farmed and humanely reared and that sort of thing. What I'd like to say to you is that's not enough. You should become vegetarians or vegans instead. Thanks.
So Peter has done, I think, an excellent job of giving a kind of overview, really, of where Hetty Baez's work fits against the general background of artists increasingly showing an interest in the relationship between humans and other animals. But there are traditions of this that really go back even further than the cave paintings, all the way back actually to the Ice Age, where we have early images of animals that were carved by people. And Peter mentioned some artists who are important, and I don't know whether we call this a genre, a movement, an increasing site of engagement between the arts and important ideas about animals, but certainly artists like Sue Coe and Barbara Dover are important in this respect. I'd like to mention a few other artists. Unfortunately, I didn't bring any images, but Marina Zerkow and Natalie Jeremijenko, two New York-based artists. Natalie Jeremijenko is an Australian, who in some cases make artworks that actually involve cooperative relationships with animals that are not quite domesticated animals, but are brought to places voluntarily to interact, in some cases, with artificial robotic devices. A German artist based in New York named Haida Hatri, who makes these amazing, beautiful flowers that she exhibits that you then realize are actually made from the refuse from slaughterhouses. So there's an enormous amount of stuff now that's going on, I think, in the art world that relates to our relationship with animals. And I think the work that Hetty Baez is doing occupies an honored place against that background. The work that she has shown us downstairs is, I think, interestingly confronting, in the sense that we look at these images of these animals, they confront us, they look at us, we look at them, but yet they aren't confrontational images in the way, say, that Sue Coe's images are confrontational. These works aren't paintings, but it's easy to see why somebody might think they're paintings, because they are, in a sense, painterly, in the sense that there is the mark of the artist that is very strongly placed on these images. There's a kind of revealing simplicity to the images when you see them from afar, and then when you approach them, you see the enormous complexity of layering and piecing together these images out of many, many different pieces of paper, having been processed through other activities like burning and tearing and so on and so forth. I think this idea of the simplicity of the images is also fed by the fact that we see these animals out of context. We don't see the cow in a slaughterhouse, we see the cow. We don't see the dog with the child, we see the dog. We're not used to seeing animals this way in such an isolated environment, and that forces us to look at them in a way that we might not otherwise look at them. We see these animals, I think, in this isolated way as being beautiful, dignified, but yet they often look harried. They often look not quite settled. They aren't, in that sense, idealized animals and idealized images of animals. So I think this work then should take an important place against really a whole diversity now of aesthetic expression that calls into question in different ways the human relationship with animals. And I want to just make 2 points then, 2 more analytical points about this in conclusion. The first is that this work in the arts is really going on against a whole background of cultural change and changes in our cultural expressions regarding animals. There is increasingly an academic movement, which is sometimes known as animal studies, where increasingly people are writing about animals in literature, people are interested in the roles of animals in performance, and in all kinds of areas where animals had previously been invisible. So it's not just in philosophy, and it's not just in the visual arts, but there is increasing attention being paid to animals across the whole range of intellectual, artistic, and cultural expressions. The second point I want to make is about the diversity of these expressions, and here is where I want to engage a little with Jeff's remarks about the killing of animals. In some ways, I think it's the health of an area of intellectual or aesthetic inquiry that there are a diversity of views that can be and are expressed. It shows that somehow these issues have become of such great cultural moment that the wagons don't have to be circled and not everyone has to agree about the particular theoretical underpinnings of a view. And when it comes to philosophy, I think it's worth noting that in some ways the difference of opinion about whether it's intrinsically wrong to kill animals, even if they aren't self-conscious, is a view that's been very much debated among philosophers really for now 30 years. Peter's book, Animal Liberation, was published in 1975, and the views about the killing of animals that Peter explained to us today were pretty much those that were represented in that book. But in 1983, Tom Reagan published a book called The Case for Animal Rights, in which he very articulately made the case for another point of view, namely the point of view that animals have a right to life, and under most standard conditions, it's wrong to kill them, even if they have painless deaths and happy lives. Now, I just want to conclude by saying 2 things about this. The first is, there's really, theoretically, now I think we're at a place where we've thought about these issues enough to recognize that there's really a whole raft of important issues that are not yet fully closed and fully theorized. I think they have to do, for example, with the relationship between companion animals and domestic animals. Many people have the idea that, for example, if you see an elk suffering in a wilderness area, that we have no obligation to provide medical attention in the way that we would in the case of domestic animals, for example. But yet, from another perspective, suffering is suffering. And if the elk is suffering, why should its pain not be relieved? That's another area in which I think there are different views that are not fully theorized. There are also questions about endangered species. I mean, is the fact that one animal represents a shrinking population, does that give that animal more value than if an animal is from a common species? Well, again, culturally, we tend to behave as if that's the case. But if we think that animals matter individually, why should it matter how many of their kind, so to speak, happen to exist? So there's a lot of very interesting theoretical issues about which philosophers are having debates and will, I think, increasingly become debates. But the point, I guess, that I want to make in closing is that I think for practical reasons, some of these theoretical disputes are really not of so much moment. The animals that you get in whole food that are supposed to have had happy lives probably didn't have very happy lives, and almost certainly were not painlessly killed. So I think at the end of the day, for practical purposes, Jeff's call for a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle is one that we really all should endorse. Thank you.
I want to thank all three, those three remarkable talks. And Peter doesn't want to respond now, so we do have about 20 minutes for you to ask questions or make statements. We have got microphones here, and I'm going to ask you to come down, if you want to speak, to come down and use one of the microphones, and if you would identify yourself, please.
My name is George Graham. I'm a philosophy professor, former colleague of Jim Rachels and Greg Pence, Peter. 2 points. First, one in response to Jeff. I had the pleasure of having dinner with Temple Grandin some years ago, and I asked her your question. And she said she's aware of the irony of trying to relieve suffering, but expediting killing. However, in the real world, expediting suffering often happens to be the best a person can do. Whether that's a response or not may be debated, but I have a possible explanation, not a warrant or a justification, for why killing a human being is not as bad as killing a non-human animal. And it lies in what might be called residual Kantianism. Because part of what Kant seemed to mean by making the self-consciousness of human beings something precious is that in the normal case, we can think of our lives as our lives. We have an awareness of life as a life. We have an awareness of its limits, of its boundaries, of its opportunities, of its availabilities, of its pleasures, its pain, and its relationships. And that gives us a kind of psychological complexity to a life, which is of a different scale than the life of the vast majority of non-human animals. It makes us kind of oases of value that are in some sense richer than the life of a single animal, like a single dog or a single cat. This doesn't necessarily justify killing them and avoiding killing us, but it does lend some prima facie plausibility to thinking of our life being in some sense more precious than the life of a non-human animal. And this question is directed at any of you who wish to address it, whether what you might think of this comment, and it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was mainly a response to what I said. I'll start off, if I may, just by saying that I agree completely with all that you said, both about Temple Grandin and about the greater value and significance of the lives of normal children and adult human beings. I think you're right in thinking that the difference has to do with our greater psychological complexity, and in particular, our greater psychological unity over time, which is made possible by our high degree of self-consciousness. Now, that's not present in fetuses or newborn infants, so there are going to be problems about thinking that this kind of special value is present in or informs the lives of all human beings. But I didn't mean to imply that I thought that killing a non-human animal is anywhere near as bad as killing a person. And I hope nobody took that away as my message. It's just that if we're a human being, if an animal is going to be killed, there's got to be something that is sufficient to justify depriving that individual animal of all the good of its projected future life. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I very largely endorse what Jeff said then, that it doesn't justify speciesism. When I was objecting to speciesism, I think the fact that there are some differences between different individuals is not the same as saying that we are justified in saying that you have a higher moral status merely because you're a member of a particular species, in this case, Homo sapiens. And I would like to add, since you mentioned Temple Grandin, that I've also had contact with her over the years, and yeah, I think she's doing what she can, in fact, to reduce the suffering of non-human animals. It's a somewhat invidious position to be in, but I can understand why she should be taking the steps that she has. I think she has actually very significantly reduced the suffering of non-human animals.
Just one quick comment on this sort of killing persons versus non-persons, or killing animals and killing humans. I think it's a very, very difficult question, because in a way there's two ways of looking at this. One is, if you think that persons or certain kinds of humans have much more complex and in some ways much more valuable lives than non-humans, although you may say non-humans have valuable lives. From a certain point of view, then, if you kill the person rather than the non-person, much more value is being lost. That's true from one point of view. From another point of view, both the person and the non-person are losing, when they're killed, everything that they have. Now, if you compare these two perspectives on the question about, is it worse for a rich person to lose $1 million or a poor person to lose $1,000, well, in one sense, it's worse for the rich person to lose the $1 million than the poor person to lose the $1,000. From another point of view, you might suppose they've each lost everything that they have. And I think, in some way, the same sort of puzzle, or at least conflicting set of intuitions, comes up with the animal case.
Thank you. Can I ask you to hold it for just a minute? I'll take this gentleman and then sit down for just a second.
I have a question, and I wish to make a point about Peter's concept of speciation. Now, of course, we understand mammals are very similar to us, and there's no question that they feel pain and they suffer. There's no question about that. Then we get to the species of birds, turkeys, chickens, ducks, and so on. And do they feel pain? Are they suffering when we kill them? I think so. Then you get to the next level of species, or the two levels of species that I wish to talk about, and that's fish and insects. Now you say insects, well, we kill them, we step on them, they're a pain. But ants have a developed society. They do, we know that. And if you take this concept to its full reality, you have a right to kill ants. And then I'll get to fish. And people fish for sport, we fish for food. And the question I give to the panel is, what is the position on fish? We kill millions of fish every year, to the point where some of these species are disappearing. Do fish feel pain? Do fish suffer at all? Or are they part of the speciation that do not feel pain or suffer? Because fishermen will tell you that, oh, fish don't feel pain. Is there anything we say about this? Is there any data related to how fish feels?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Specifically on fish, there is data, there is research. There's a book by a scientist called Victoria Braithwaite, which is, I think, called Do Fish Feel Pain? Some very direct form of a question like that, anyway. And she presents evidence that suggests that fish do feel pain. some of that is related to the nature of the nervous system, but there is also some experimental research when the fish are particularly sensitive around the lips, especially bottom-feeding fish. And I think there was some research done in England in which bee venom was put into the lips of fish, and they certainly respond as if they're in pain. They're much less likely to go rubbing around the bottom as if that hurts them. And if you then give them an analgesic, some aspirin, paracetamol-like substance, it appears to relieve their pain, and they are less sensitive than they were before. So I do think that there's quite good evidence that fish feel pain. Ants and other insects are much more difficult because, although, as you say, they have a society in a sense, their behaviour is rather more rigid. An example of this is ants. When an individual ant dies in one of the species that lives in colonies, the worker ants will remove the dead body from the colony. So you think, oh well, in some way they're responding to the fact that if you have a dead body in the colony, that's bad, it's going to rot. But it turns out that it's a purely chemical response. They emit a particular chemical, and if you put that chemical on the body of a living ant, the worker ants will carry that living ant out in exactly the same way, even though it's wriggling and moving in the way the dead ant isn't. So, this suggests that there's perhaps not really awareness going on of the difference between a live and dead ant that leads them to carry it out. So, we don't know. I think this is speculation, but I think it's possible that insects like ants are behaving in a more robotic way that doesn't involve consciousness. But,
I remember, just very quickly, reading a long time ago an article in one of the British newspapers that reported that, I don't know how they did this, but if a fly was feeding or grooming itself, an ordinary house fly, if the experimenters plucked out a leg or plucked off one of its wings, in a way that didn't involve sudden movement, that kind of thing, it just kept right on feeding or grooming as if nothing had happened. And that suggested to me that in these experimental conditions, although flies may be very good at evading fly swatters and that sort of thing, there's some evidence that they don't suffer or feel pain.
So I don't know about flies and ants, but I know a little about fishermen. So let me tell you something about fishermen. I once wrote an op-ed piece for the local Minneapolis newspaper, which ran on the first day of fishing season, sort of basically saying they should stop fishing. And it kind of surveyed the evidence about fish pain, for example. Basically, fish feel pain, it's not really worth it to do this, and so on and so forth. What surprised me was it got a ton of response, and a lot of the response was, of course they feel pain. That's the whole point. They wouldn't be fighting on the hook, and it wouldn't be such an interesting sport if they weren't being driven by pain. Who does a stupid college professor think he is? Calling this into question.
Oh, thank you very much. Because I am a fish fancier. I want to say that. And those fish can see me when I approach the tank and feed them. They see me. They come to the corner. And I know they feel pain. And I know that. I have a good feeling about the fish that I maintain. So, thank you.
My question is addressed to the first responder, and it's related to this called word justification, and also related to what Professor Singer brought about the Kant. Now, in a different book, I think it's a critique of judgment, Kant made a statement that a war is justified under certain circumstances, in particular when war brings sublime to the warrior. So my question is, your criteria of whether to kill animal or not depends on the differential of pleasure, say eating fish versus evading. Now, if we compare this to what Kant said about killing people, two aspects. One is your criteria, this differential in pleasure, is a direct extension of Kant's feeling sublime in killing people. And two, if it is, then you're bringing a criteria for morality from something sublime, which I don't know whether it's sensual or supersensual, to the level of pleasure, which is definitely sensual. So can you address these two aspects? One, is yours an extension of sublime in killing people? And two, are you changing the criteria of morality from something supersensual to sensual?
Thank you. I think that there are, in part for the reasons that the first questioner gave, the moral constraints that govern the killing of persons are much stronger and more stringent than the constraints that govern the killing of animals. I think that these two forms of killing are actually governed by different principles. That's because I think that persons have rights that animals don't have. And so there's a phrase from a now deceased Harvard philosopher. The phrase was Kantianism for people, utilitarianism for animals. And my view is a little bit like that. So Peter's view is utilitarianism for everybody. And my view is, something like utilitarianism is right for our dealing with especially non-self-conscious animals. But much more is required in order to justify killing a person. I certainly think that Kant's idea that you could justify killing somebody in war because the experience of being a warrior is sublime in this way is a ludicrous idea. It is, however, kind of what motivated Wittgenstein, another 20th century philosopher, to fight in the First World War. He wanted to feel the danger and so on, and the sublimity of combat. And that's one of the reasons that he joined the Austrian army in the First World War. Now, I think that if there's a justification for killing human beings in war, it is that the people being killed are in the wrong and are engaged in violating the rights of their victims and thereby make themselves liable to attack. As Stan said, I've written a good bit about war and have a book called Killing in War, and my view about killing in war is that it's wholly asymmetrical between the soldiers who have a just cause and soldiers who lack a just cause. And in my view, which is quite contrary to the traditional just war theory, it's not permissible to fight in a war that lacks a just cause.
Okay, we're just going to have a final question.
Hi, I'm Steve Hiltner. I write at PrincetonNatureNotes.org about nature in Princeton. And I wanted to ask about intention in terms of, and the impact of animals on plants. Obviously here in town we used to have a very controversial program. It's no longer very controversial to call the deer herd. If there's too many deer, they really destroy the plants, and that affects other animals that depended on those plants in the forest. So we generally go around intentionally reducing the deer herd so that there's fewer deer that are unintentionally killed in a much more barbaric way by the cars. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out, obviously one's intentionally killing an animal, but it's for a greater good ecologically. Many species would otherwise perish if the deer herds, if there's an imbalance. And of course we've gotten rid of all the timber wolves and mountain lions that used to control them. So I'm wondering what your opinion is of this kind of issue.
Just a very quick comment by me, and that is that I recall reading a few months ago an article in the New York Times about a town somewhere in Connecticut where they were having this problem, and they solved the problem by some kind of birth control for the local deer. Well, you're saying that, but what the New York Times said was that it did work in this town in Connecticut. And
so let me first address your specific question about intention. On the ethical view that I hold, what we want to do is reduce suffering. I agree that if with Jeff's remarks to the extent that if animals are enjoying their lives, leading good lives, it's good for them to continue to do so. But it doesn't really matter to the animal whether it's killed by a car or by a bullet, assuming that both of them kill it equally quickly. And in fact, if you have a good shot, I guess, an expert marksman, you probably can do that more humanely with a bullet than with a car. So from that perspective, if indeed it's true that the number of deer that are going to be killed is the same whether you have a culling program or not, then I don't object to there being a culling program. If it does vary, the number of deer, then you have to look at what's going to happen, as you say, consequences to the whole ecological system and to other animals that depend on that system are certainly relevant. On the question of contraception for wild animals, it certainly does succeed in limited populations. It's worked, for example, for the wild horses of the islands of the Delmarva Peninsula, Chincoteague and Assateague, I think, where you have small isolated populations, you can certainly do it. If we can't do it for deer here, it's only because we haven't really bothered to put a lot of effort into research. I mean, I'm sure that it's not beyond our ingenuity to find contraceptives that work for wild animals, but nobody's terribly interested because it's quite cheap to kill them, and in fact, people like to kill them because then they get the meat from them. So I think that's a decision that we make, if not immediately as of what are we going to do next year, it's a decision we make as of what means are we going to have available to control wild animal populations over the coming decades.
So the thing is, we've got all these problems. We've got overpopulations of deer. We have nasty oceans that are attacking our summer houses. You know, we have forest fires that are, that want to burn down beautiful houses and mountains. You know, in the core of this problem is that we don't actually think about what our relationship is to landscape and to nature in the first place, and what the systematic relations are that we want to have with the places that we live and the animals that live there. So in the case of deer, for example, if you look at this, from a landscape ecology point of view, essentially what's happened in places like New Jersey and Connecticut is that people have essentially ripped down the forests, which had relatively low deer density, and created the most wonderful utopian deer habitat that anyone could possibly design, and then decide they have a problem with too many deer. This is really an instance of the same problem that happens when people build houses on barrier islands, and then much to their shock and horror, actually have problems with seawater intrusion. And we can go on with the list of these kinds of problems, but the real solutions are in starting to think about what our community should look like spatially, as well as in other respects.